All right, so here I have an example of pressure-controlled ventilation inverse ratio. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're in assist control or SIMV. So you can do PC, AC, or PC, SIMV, because the fact of the matter is the patient is paralyzed, and therefore he's not going to trigger anyways. So if you take a look at this, it's just like PC, AC without any patient triggers. You see that I have a time trigger, and a time trigger. My I time is set because in pressure control I always set an I time. Okay? And if I look at my flow rate decelerates just like it always does with a pressure control setting. It zeros, it stays at zero until that I time is done, and then my patient exhales. If I look at my volume scaler, my volume goes in. The amount of volume that's going to go in goes in at the point that the flow decelerates to zero. No more flow is going in during this point because the two pressures, the alveolar pressure and the ventilator pressure, have equilibrated. Okay? At this point at the end of my I time, the patient's allowed to exhale. So you see expiratory flow coming out, and the patient's exhaling, and the volume's coming back out of the patient. But since I have such a short expiratory time, the next inspiration begins before the gas and the volume has come all the way out. I essentially trap that gas there. I mean to do that. And my next breath begins the cycle over again. So if I were to classify this, I would say inverse ratio pressure control is time triggered, pressure limited, time cycled ventilation. To talk about it in layman's terms, I set a rate and I set an inverse ratio in which my I time is much longer than my expiratory time. Since I set such a long I time, and since I'm in pressure control ventilation, my flow rate's going to decelerate to zero. It'll stay at zero until the end of my expiratory time, and then during my expiratory time, the patient will start to exhale. But the fact of the matter is my expiratory time is so short, and I want to keep my alveoli open, I will reestablish my inspiratory pressure and not allow my patient to fully exhale, not allow all the volume to completely come back out before my next breath. Okay, here I have pressure-controlled SIMV, and then I add pressure support on this other side to show you what that would look like. So in SIMV, I set a rate and I set a machine breath type. The breath type in this case is a pressure-controlled breath type. My pressure level here is the same on these three breaths. That should be the exact same pressure, even though it doesn't perfectly look like it. So here my patient is, he's at my PEEP level. There's a time trigger. He goes to the set pressure level for the set I time, and then he comes back down to the PEEP level. When that occurs, you see that there is a flow rate that is a decelerating ramp in an anatomical type fashion that decelerates to zero, and then the patient exhales at the end of the I time, and volume is delivered. If I look at the next big machine breath, I see that it is patient triggered. In other words, SIMV has synchronized its big machine breath with the patient effort. The flow rate is the same with this as it is with this, because these are my big machine breaths. The flow rate decelerates and then exhales at the end of the I time. And you see that my volume delivery is a little bit different than this volume delivery, because I'm not controlling the volume, I'm controlling the pressure in pressure-controlled SIMV. Now what occurred between these two breaths? Here I have my machine-triggered breath, or my time-triggered breath, and my patient-triggered synchronized breath. Well, in SIMV, remember, SIMV allows for spontaneous breathing. So here I have some spontaneous breathing that's occurring between these two breaths. And if I look at the flow pattern with that, they don't assume a decelerating flow pattern like the pressure breaths do. They're a sinusoidal flow pattern. Okay, they're not perfectly the same because they're spontaneous flow patterns, right? We breathe in a sinusoidal flow pattern naturally. And you see that the volumes delivered are less with those spontaneous breaths because they're not having a big pressure that's augmenting them. Okay? After this breath, you see that I have one spontaneous effort, one spontaneous flow rate, one small tidal volume. and then it was time for the SIMV to give a big machine breath, and it gave that big pressure-controlled breath for the set I time. I get the same flow pattern and a big volume delivery. Well, at this point, we've added pressure support. Okay, we'll just call that 10 centimeters of pressure support. I didn't put it up the numerical values on here. And remember, these pressure control levels are supposed to be the exact same level. Okay, I'm not an artist. Here, since we've added pressure support, when the patient triggers the breath, remember, pressure support is a pressure boost. So it brings that breath to a preset pressure level until the flow rate decelerates to a certain point, and the flow rate cycles that breath off. Volume delivery will vary because this is pressure support. So if I were to classify pressure-controlled SIMV, I would say the SIMV is either machine or patient-triggered, pressure-limited, time-cycled ventilation. The layman's explanation would be pressure-controlled SIMV, I set a rate, I set a pressure control level, and a set I time. The patient will receive this pressure control level at this set I time for the set rate. If the patient breathes over the set rate, they will receive spontaneous breaths. And the machine will try to synchronize its machine breaths with the spontaneous effort. If I have to explain pressure control and SIMV with pressure support, I would say the pressure-controlled breaths are either time-triggered or patient-triggered into inspiration. They're pressure-limited, and they're time-cycled into expiration. The pressure-supported breaths are only patient-triggered, pressure-limited, and flow-cycled into expiration. Okay, so here we're describing volume-assured pressure support, a combined mode of ventilation that uses both pressure and volume as a controlling variable, depending upon what happens during the course of the breath. On breath 1 and breath 4, these look just like a normal pressure-supported breath. You'll see that the patient triggers the breath, the flow rate decelerates, and once the flow rate decelerates to a certain point, the ventilator says, has my volume been achieved? And in breath 1 and breath 4, the volume has at least been achieved that I had set. So at that point, the breath would shut it off. So this breath and this breath, as far as the pressure scaler, doesn't look any different. Neither does the flow scaler really, and the volume scaler obviously looks like a volume scaler. Breath 2 and breath 3 is where the volume assured part comes in. Because with volume assured pressure support, not only do I set a pressure support level, in this case I have 15 of pressure support over 5 of peak, but I also say, look at your flow rate and make sure you get a certain tidal volume. So as the patient triggers the breath, they get a high initial flow rate, which decelerates. At the point that the flow rate decelerates to your set flow rate, the ventilator says, has my volume been achieved? In breath 2, the volume hasn't been achieved yet. Therefore, the flow rate will stay at the set flow rate, 30 liters per minute in this case, until the volume is achieved. And look what happens to your pressure scaler. No longer is it square, as you would see in breath 1 and breath 4, but now you see that the pressure scaler goes up, much like a volume pressure scaler would go up. As soon as the volume is achieved, the volume says cycle off, and therefore the breath comes back down. Breath 3 is an exact same illustration of breath 2, in which the patient triggers, decelerating flow rate comes down to your set flow rate, ventilator checks to see if the volume was achieved, volume was not achieved, flow rate continues until the volume is achieved, and then the breath shuts off. Breath 4 demonstrates that a person in this mode of ventilation can exceed your target tidal volume, and the ventilator won't stop the patient. So in this pressure-supported breath, if the patient were to pull hard and take a nice deep breath, they could get a lot of flow and a lot of volume, and therefore not volume cycle. So to classify volume assured pressure support, you would say it's only patient triggered into inspiration. On a breath that the volume target was delivered before the flow rate, or when the volume target was delivered as the flow rate decelerated to your set flow, the pressure supported breath would be a normal pressure supported breath, meaning it's patient triggered, pressure limited, and then flow cycled. On the breaths that the volume target was not achieved by the time the flow rate decelerated to your set flow rate, those breaths you would have to classify as patient triggered, initially pressure limited, but then turning into a volume breath and volume cycled at the end of that breath. So here we have volume control SIMV with pressure support. So we have two different types of breath. We have our volume delivery breaths, indicated here by our pressure scaler with a slow rise to the peak inspiratory pressure and then going back down to my peak level. And then my pressure supported breaths, which are pressure breaths, indicated by the pressure going up to the set pressure supported level and staying at that pressure support level until the end of that breath, which will cycle off due to a decelerating flow waveform. My volume breaths, you see that I have drawn or set a square flow pattern. My pressure supported breaths, you see that I have drawn a decelerating flow pattern. And notice that it's not linear like something that I would set. It's something that just occurs because of the pressure difference between the ventilator circuit and my patient's lungs. And then finally, when I look down here at my volume deliveries, on my volume controlled breaths, which would be this breath, and this breath, this flow pattern, this flow pattern, this flow pattern, I'm delivering a set tidal volume that's always the same because this is volume control. On the pressure supported breaths, I am delivering different volumes depending on what the patient pulls, because obviously pressure breaths don't determine what the volume is, but isn't always constant because pressure breaths control pressure. So if I were to classify volume controlled SIMV with pressure support, I would say the breaths, the SIMV breaths, are volume controlled. They are either time triggered or patient triggered into inspiration. They are volume limited and they are volume cycled. The pressure supported breaths are patient triggered, pressure limited, and flow cycled. In layman's terms, volume controlled SIMV is I set a rate, I set a tidal volume. If the patient breathes over the set rate, they can do spontaneous breathing. Those spontaneous breaths can be augmented with pressure support. And the SIMV breaths try to synchronize with the patient's spontaneous efforts.